Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Kai Haverila. Kai recently completed his PhD in marketing at John Molson School of Business at Concordia University in Montreal. Currently, he's a lecturer at Concordia University. We will be discussing his PhD research today on consumer trolling behavior in online brand communities. It's a great pleasure to have you on the show, Kai.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a great opportunity. Thank you for allowing me to present some of my research and findings.
What is online trolling behavior and what are some of its consequences?
Uh, that's a very interesting question because when you ask almost anyone, doesn't matter if it's a practitioner, let's say an online community manager, a scholar, a person who's been targeted by the behavior, someone who's witnessed it, someone who engages in the behavior, they kind of have their own almost like definition and conceptualization of bullying. And a lot of times, people, let's say they might witness it or they might
Yeah,
be a victim of it or a target of it. And a lot of times, they know that it's happened, but they can't necessarily say exactly what it is, and they can't necessarily put it into concrete terms.
yeah.
Uh, so, there were a few common themes and kind of underlying factors that I found in my research when I started kind of going over this. And that kind of led to my own definition that I used in my thesis. So I kind of looked at it as trolling is an evolving relational. So it's sort of between, two people or more. And it's a multifaceted behavior that kind of varies in its valence. So whether it's positive or negative, depending upon the context,
Mhm.
the level of severity and its form, kind of depending upon the actors that are involved. So again, some people will have, be very well versed in online culture and kind of know that, okay, that's an expected behavior. And maybe they kind of, don't view it in too negative of a light. Whereas some people, might sort of respond quite negatively to it and, might be rightfully so or not. And also kind of depends on the online context where it takes place. So again, some places are, maybe a little bit more lax in terms of their rules and code of conduct. So they kind of expect it to a certain extent, like within reason. And then other places maybe try to be a little bit more formal and proper, where, they have a almost like zero tolerance kind of approach to it. But even that might be a little bit of a problem because, well, maybe sometimes you want to throw a little bit of humor and jokes around. And then, sometimes that might be interpreted as trolling. Then some people don't necessarily like that.
Right.
And it's also the final kind of point is that it's intentionally performed by individuals or groups. And it includes a few underlying factors. So things like deception, disruption, antagonism, maybe some
Mhm.
aggression. And
Mhm.
it's really done for the purposes of
Yeah,
provoking negative reactions from individuals.
I see.
So this definition kind of highlights, that it's highly contextual, like I was kind of saying. It's
Yeah.
social, and it's
Mhm.
also very, highly variable. So a lot of times, again, it is kind of always changing. And even though, like, sometimes I can, like, maybe say that, okay, this is clearly an instance of it, I can't necessarily, let's say, explain it to a layperson who doesn't have any experience and tell them, well, what is it specifically? Well, I don't know. It's just that I kind of know myself. So that's
Mhm.
kind of often like what it is. And also, again, like I kind of mentioned, it all often depends upon the online setting. And
Yeah.
it's also kind of important to remember the intentional nature of it. So, if
Yeah.
you accidentally, let's say, upset someone and there's some sort of misunderstanding or misinterpretation on either, your side or their side,
Yeah.
then it isn't trolling in that case. If it happens to just
Mhm.
be that, someone maybe you say something and then you kind of look at the
Mhm.
tone afterwards and go like, oh, that could have been misinterpreted and kind of seen in a bad light. But if
Yeah.
it is something, let's say like accidental, like I remember that I've had a few instances where,
Uh-huh.
someone says like I said something and then a bunch of people in the comments, kind of went
Yeah.
like, oh, you're clearly trolling. Then I kind of went like, wait, am I? And then I kind of looked at the like how it was said and then looked at
Yeah.
the tone. Like, oh, well, I meant it in this way,
Yeah.
but they kind of read it in that way. But I could totally see why they saw it that way. And then I
Yeah.
kind of went like, well, it wasn't. But sometimes
Right.
in online context, it's maybe sometimes a little bit difficult to convey tone
Yeah.
sometimes, right? So
Yeah.
when you reread something that you've said, you might go like, oh, that could have been said that in that kind of way.
Right. Yeah.
And in terms of kind of consequences,
Yeah.
actually, when I initially did some research, there wasn't really too much on the specific kind of consequences and outcomes, but sort of,
Yeah.
I think, as a few years progressed, I think like when I started this in 2017, 2018, there wasn't really much research on it, but I think in the past year, I think it was from 2021 onwards, there were
Yeah.
a few papers that started
Yeah.
started discussing a few of the consequences. So they
Yeah.
looked at things like how trolling can negatively affect kind of community level outcomes. So things like positive word of mouth intentions,
Hmm.
community satisfaction, and community following intentions. So if
Yeah.
people kind of see that, okay, trolling is a pretty common thing here, and they're not really talking about, the sort of,
Mm.
initial purpose or the actual purpose of the, the community itself, and they're
Yeah.
just kind of joking around and not talking too much, and it's very off topic.
Yeah.
Okay, well, probably don't want to be a part of this anymore.
Mm.
And I also found that it can kind of encourage further trolling as well. So maybe someone kind of says something to you, and then you kind of go like, oh well, they didn't get any repercussions for that, and well, fine, I guess I'll do it as well. It's this kind of idea of
Ah.
negativity begets more negativity at that point, especially when moderators or community
Yeah.
managers, let's say, have a very lax approach to how to
Ah.
deal with it.
Yeah.
I think I found a few papers that discussed how it can harm brand image and
Hmm.
reputation as well,
Hmm.
and it could
Hmm.
also potentially have a negative effect on employee well-being. So it's
Yeah.
this thing where oftentimes, like an employee, let's say, who works like as a brand community manager,
Yeah.
they don't they well, in an ideal world, they shouldn't have to focus on trying to moderate these kinds of comments and to give punishments and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff or reprimands to them. They should be trying to encourage discussion, engagement,
Right.
create interesting
Yeah.
content, that kind of stuff. So
Uh-huh.
it's something where nowadays they do kind of have to deal with that, but
Yeah.
they're probably going like, well, this isn't what I necessarily signed up for. So
Mm.
I think through some interviews they kind of found out that it does have
Mm.
a negative impact on that end as
Mm.
well.
Mm.
So yeah, that was kind of what I've initially kind of found from previous research in terms of the consequences as well.
So why were you interested in this topic? Uh,
Yeah, it's a kind of an interesting thing. Like when I was first accepted into the PhD program
yeah.
at Concordia,
Yeah.
my initial interest was kind of related to the just kind of general kind of behaviors and practices on
Yeah.
social media. So
Yeah.
again, very kind of very broad topic because that can include almost anything.
Yeah.
I just remember like that was kind of what I initially said because I think like in my first year we had a bunch of these job talks with people who were
Mm.
trying to get assistant or associate professor
Yeah.
positions in Concordia.
Hmm.
And we kind of got like a bit of like the PhD students were able to talk with this person who had the job talk and everything. So I was kind of put on the
Yeah.
spot, within basically my first week, going like, "So what is it that you want to research?" And I went like, "Oof, what? I don't. Social media. I guess I want to see some kind of conversations, discussion.
Yeah.
I'm not like quite sure." So that was kind of what I initially kind of came with off the top of my head.
Yeah.
And then I took this course called, I think it was called The Meaning and Management of Brands. It's taught by Dr. Bianca Groman at Concordia, fantastic researcher.
Yeah.
And I took, yeah, that course. And
Hmm.
I remember we kind of, the PhD students, it was kind of a mix with PhD and MSc students. So the
Yeah.
PhD students had to kind of lead discussions on the topic that we were kind of, focusing on that week.
Yeah.
So I just happened to, I'm not sure if I chose it or if it was randomly assigned, but I took one on brand communities, and
Okay.
that kind of led me to work on a Shirk Grants kind of funded project where I did a lot of
Yeah.
research on brand community practices,
Yeah.
engagement.
Yeah.
I think it was different kinds of constructs, so it's predictors and
Yeah.
consequences.
Yeah.
And I even looked at a few like different types of brand community members. So things like there's lurkers, which whenever I'm a part of a community, that's typically what I'm a part of. So I'll kind of read the content and
Yeah.
kind of consume it, but I'm not necessarily going to comment or create any content myself.
All right.
And then there's posters, so the people who again do create the content,
Yeah.
the funny
Yeah.
pictures or videos or gifs, what
Yeah.
have you, on there, and they
Yeah.
also engage in discussions, comments, and that
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And but then
Interesting.
what I noticed
Yeah.
was that okay, they're talking about all these fantastic positive outcomes and
Yeah.
different types of practices and behaviors. That's all well and good. But I've been on the internet. I've seen that, quite often there
Yeah.
are also some negative behaviors and practices that
Mm.
exist
Mm.
in,
Mm.
communities, online groups, any kind of social media platform that you're a part of. A
Yeah.
lot of times like they'll either highlight it because they're trying to encourage more engagement, or it's just maybe a pretty prominent thing depending upon the context.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to kind of investigate the kind of more negative behaviors and practices in brand communities. I wanted to get a little bit more of a comprehensive picture, and I guess like a sort of more realistic kind of picture of the setting.
Yeah.
So after some investigation, I kind of find that okay, like trolling behavior probably is kind of I guess the kind of most prevalent kind of behavior that kind of is going on, and it's kind of almost like seen like almost like as an umbrella term. So like anything that is negative, people will kind of say like, "Oh, you're trolling," even though that's not necessarily the case. Kind of what I learned, but again, it is
Right.
kind of seen as like any type of anything that is seen as negative, whether even if it is like a little bit different, people
Yeah.
kind of say that, okay, well, it's just trolling, even though it necessarily isn't
Mm.
the case.
Yeah. Interesting.
So yeah, I kind of chose that because again, it's something that most people have witnessed, and
Yeah.
a lot of people maybe have like either seen it like again like either they've seen it or they've sometimes had it directed at them.
Yeah.
And I also chose brand communities as a context, not only because I was,
Hmm.
kind of familiar with that setting, again, because I
Yeah.
did a little bit of research on it, but I also wanted to kind of examine a setting that was relevant in a marketing context. So I didn't want to just look at social media platforms in general or online groups, because again, you can obviously have, communities about just like, let's say, you can have communities, just about general interests or hobbies, but I wanted to kind of be a little bit more specific and chose like a marketing specific context. So I decided to choose brand communities in that case.
Nice. So, what did you do to study online trolling behavior for your PhD?
Yeah, so for that, the focus of my research and kind of in my thesis specifically,
Yeah.
I wanted to create a more solid foundation
Hmm.
for the construct, because
Okay.
I wanted to study trolling from a marketing perspective, like I kind of mentioned just a little earlier,
Yeah.
because that in that case, like in that moment in 2018, I think when I decided to do that, there really wasn't too much research on it. So I think like off the
Hmm.
top of my head, I could remember there was like one prominent paper that I kind of referred to quite a lot.
Mm.
I think it was a 2017 paper by Maya Golf Papez and Akant Ver. I think they're,
Mm.
uh, yeah, they do some really good work on trolling. They're kind of basically saying how it
Yeah.
emerged due to routine act. I think it was called routine activity theory, where basically,
Mm.
if the kind of context is right,
Mm.
if there is a kind of a setting like that, kind of can encourage trolling if there is the right kind of target, and if there's people who are basically kind of like if they're well aren't moderators or any kind of
Yeah.
managers to kind of police the situation, if they kind of see like,
Hmm.
okay, this is like an opportunity, and they were specifically looking at it from a marketing context, but again,
Hmm.
hadn't been done very
Yeah.
often. So there was some research on trolling,
Hmm.
but I'd kind of say that it seemed like the discoveries or the findings,
Yeah.
they kind of seemed unconnected. So one was
Uh,
looking at something like this from
yeah.
this kind of context and setting. Someone was looking
Mm.
at something completely different. It's over
Yeah.
there, and someone was looking at it from this kind of perspective with this
Right.
type of methodology. All
Hmm.
good
Hmm.
findings, but they kind
Yeah.
of seemed almost piecemeal. They didn't seem like there
Mm.
was a maybe
Yeah.
common kind of theme or foundation that they were necessarily kind of referring to.
Hmm.
So knowing that, I kind of had two ideas in mind. I kind of wanted to create some kind of conceptual research that kind of introduced maybe a few kind of introductory kind of research kind of propositions and
Yeah.
questions that maybe should be addressed in trolling research. These kinds of things are like again kind of set the foundation if you kind of are looking at these. And then I wanted those questions to, I wanted scholars to be able to answer them. So then I
Mm.
also created a comprehensive kind of measurement scale for trolling behavior and victimization so that, okay, well, I'm addressing these questions. That's great. Well, do I have some sort of tool that I can use to actually
Yeah.
answer them? Yes, because of the measurement scale that I had. So
Nice.
in the conceptual research, I kind of
Yeah.
introduced the brand trolling construct, which
Yeah.
has a fair amount of similarities with the trolling construct that I kind of mentioned with the definition earlier,
Okay.
but I kind of put it as brand trolling is a type of trolling behavior that typically takes place online and is intended to denigrate anything related to the brand and to provoke reactions from brand and
Mm.
organization related
Yeah.
actors. So it focuses a little bit more on the brand and company kind of related individuals. So
Yeah.
things like it has an impact on the community members themselves, the brand community managers, maybe even the moderators, because a lot of times they're a lot more
Yeah.
kind of forward facing. Like in a lot of general kind of online groups, the moderators kind of do things and they're very much in the background and you don't
Yeah.
necessarily even know who they are.
Yeah.
Whereas with the brand community, they want to be a little bit more formal. And then a lot of times, like, they'll maybe like say like, hey, this comment has been moderated by so and so for these reasons, because they usually do
Mm.
have a specific code of conduct that they kind of refer
Yeah.
to and everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then the research propositions and questions kind of focused on, I'd say, how do I put this? The broader kind of nature of brand trolling, where
Yeah.
it not only impacts individuals, because a lot of times when you kind of with what trolling had kind of been looked at so far, it was kind of like, okay, well, there's the trolling individual, and then there's the target and victim, and that's kind of it. Whereas in brand trolling, it also could potentially have an impact on the community as well as the brand and the organization itself. So I introduced a lot of propositions related to things like predictors,
Mm-hmm.
outcomes,
Okay.
these sort of more involved role of individuals, so things like the
Mm-hmm.
employees as well as the members themselves, as
Mm-hmm.
well as the kind of contextual elements. So what kind of might encourage brand trolling from like one community to another, or from one brand to another. Sort
Okay.
of for instance, like if a brand, let's say, is very very controversial or something, and generally kind of not like they don't necessarily put themselves in the best light. They're probably a little bit more likely to be trolled compared to, let's say, something like, like a, I don't know, not-for-profit, charitable organization. Like if,
Yeah.
that was kind of the target of trolling, that a lot of people would be going like, what on earth are you doing? Whereas like, if it's someone, some kind of controversial company,
Mm.
generally speaking, a lot of people would go like, oh, well, you know what, they probably like deserve it or something.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
they necessarily? I don't know, but like, that's probably what the general
Yeah.
public's kind of thoughts would be on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what was it? Oh yeah. Next for the kind of scale development paper,
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to create a multi-dimensional scale for
Okay.
trolling behavior and victimization. And
Yeah.
I wanted to be that
Yeah.
because when I was going over again like the hundreds of different trolling papers,
Yes.
I noticed that almost all of their definitions,
Yeah.
included a lot of underlying factors. So they mentioned things like provocation,
Yeah.
deception, uh,
Yeah.
distraction, aggression, a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of these different types of things. But
Mm-hmm.
then when it was conceptualized, maybe in those same
Mm.
papers, if they
Mm.
try to create some sort of measurement scale or,
Yeah.
sort of framework,
Yeah.
it was often just unidimensional. They would just say, oh, it's
Mm.
trolling and all these items, just measure onto it. There's no
Oh, okay.
underlying kind of factor. So I thought, okay, that's a little bit, well, not necessarily odd, but I thought, okay, well, there's clearly kind of a gap here.
Yeah.
So I kind of thought a multi-dimensional scale, one that has multiple factors, I thought that was kind of a more accurate or kind of realistic kind of measure
Mm-hmm.
of the behavior. So with
Mm-hmm.
that, I kind of created a content analysis to
Yeah.
determine some of the initial, items and the underlying
Yeah.
factors.
Yeah.
And I did a pre-test, expert review, that kind of stuff to provide a little bit of evidence of face validity. And
Yeah.
because a lot of these people, had the experts who I chose, they were people, who'd been
Yeah.
researching it. So,
Yeah.
they would say like, okay, like change the language a little bit on this because a lot of people, they're
Yeah.
familiar with trolling, but you have to be, again, try to be as, unambiguous and clear as
Yeah.
possible when you're creating a
Yeah.
scale.
Yeah.
And then they also said like, oh, this thing is, isn't, because I basically put it as on a scale of like 1 to 3, how representative do you find this to be? And then there
Mm.
were a few that were added as well.
Mm.
And then I did a few factor analyses. So just
Yeah.
basically typical kind of
Yeah.
scale development
Yeah.
steps. And I also tried to be as thorough as possible.
Yeah.
So when I did look at that,
Yeah.
I tested for things like what was it, convergent validity, discriminant
Yeah.
validity, predictive,
Yeah.
and known group. And then I
Yeah.
think I also looked at nomological validity and then discriminant validity, not only
Mm-hmm.
between the dimensions, but also between constructs, because I was kind of mentioning how trolling is an
Mm.
umbrella term. So I
Mm.
wanted to compare it against a construct that it's often kind of
Mm.
not necessarily confused with, but one that it shares a lot of similarities with.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, I compared it against cyberbullying.
Okay.
And then I
Okay.
also compared it against an established scale that did exist. But I think that scale
Yeah.
only had 4 items, but that was the
Okay.
global assessment of internet trolling. Yes, that was
Okay.
developed by Aaron Buckles, I think, in
Okay.
2014.
Okay. Cool.
And I also compared it against different types of models. So basically, I wanted to again further prove that it's multidimensional. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, I compared a 3-factor model
Mm-hmm.
versus a 1-factor model, and to see
Okay.
like which one had better fit statistics. And well, I'll explain that a
Okay.
little bit later on. But that's kind of how I approached it.
Nice. So, what did you learn from your research?
All right, so yeah, from the conceptual research,
Yeah.
I kind of very much learned that brand trolling, even though
Mm.
it's probably a little bit more of a, let's say, narrow, no, sorry, yeah, narrower or a more specific
Yeah.
context, I noticed that it's a lot more expansive compared to kind of the
Yeah.
brand trolling, that can
Yeah.
take place,
Yeah.
anywhere online. So I noticed that kind of trolling in a brand community can have an impact, again, like I was kind of mentioning, not only on the targeted individual, but it can have an impact on the community itself, or even on the brand and the company itself. Because again, if people kind of see that, oh, they have like basically like, let's say like they have a lack of a response and don't do anything, and just kind of allow it to be a little bit of a wild west, that community. Well, then a lot of people are going to go like, well, okay, well, there's clearly not any kind of, genuine conversation going on, and I'm not able to answer my questions. They're just kind of messing around with me.
Yeah.
Well, that community is not very good, so I'm not going to continue to be a part of it. I'm not going to,
Yeah.
be satisfied with it. I'm not going to tell my friends, so there's not going to be any positive word of mouth going on.
Yeah.
And not only that, like maybe you kind of see like, okay, well, clearly this brand, like, they're saying like, hey, we care about you and we have like a community where you can ask questions. But the fact that, we're just kind of allowing anything to kind of go on there, well, maybe I kind of view that brand, a little bit, have a slightly lower attitude about it, or, not as nice an attitude, or maybe I'm a little bit less satisfied. But that's actually kind of what I do want to be looking at later on.
Yeah.
And it also kind of highlighted how the roles of individuals are a little bit more involved in this context, kind of
Oh,
compared to general
yeah.
trolling. So again, because there is a specific code of conduct in place, it means that
Yeah.
employees and moderators, and not
Yeah.
only the actual employees, but also the members, they have a little bit more of power and I guess like ability to actually do something. So again,
Yeah.
like, okay, if it's a little bit of a lighthearted joking, yeah, you're probably not going to report that. If there's someone who keeps on kind of messing around and
Yeah.
is, clearly do something like negative and
Yeah.
always being off topic, like eventually you might go like, okay, I'm gonna report this. Like, okay, then like it's fine if it's like it happens a little bit here and there, but if it's
Yeah.
like constantly happening and
Yeah.
they're just keep on messing around, okay, like I'm probably gonna do something because I like this community, right? So like sometimes you
Yeah.
do want to filter a little bit of that
Y-
stuff out there.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
you want to maintain a little bit of a balance. Sometimes
Yeah.
here and there it's fine, but sometimes people push it and maybe go a little too far.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and not only that, the research kind of showed how there's a lot more to be discovered about trolling in general.
Mm.
Also, like in a marketing context. So,
Yeah.
there is a lot of empirical research that could be kind of done on the predictors and consequences
Yeah.
of the behavior as well as its victimization.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for the scale,
Yeah.
there were a few interesting findings. Again, most of it was pretty straightforward. So when
Mm.
comparing the models, it was very, very clear that the scales were multidimensional. Because
Okay.
when I did look at the three-factor model, where they kind
Yeah.
of looked at, I think it was the factors that I had were provocation,
Okay.
disruption, and
Mm-hmm.
deception.
Okay.
When I had those three factors in the confirmatory factor analysis, and when I compared the fit statistics,
Mm.
they were clearly better for the three factor and the second order models compared
Okay.
to the one factor model. So it kind of clearly showed evidence that okay, this is very much a multi-dimensional
Mm.
construct.
Mm.
Yeah. So in terms of the convergent, discriminant,
Yeah.
and predictability, all the results were fine. There was like one
Yeah.
interesting finding that I noticed with known group validity. So
Yeah.
it was confirmed and everything. And I thought, okay,
Mm.
that's great. But then when I actually looked at the mean scores,
Okay.
basically what I was doing was I wanted to, well, based on the literature, I found that, okay, a group that should score high, basically
Yeah.
that they are likely to engage in trolling and to be victims of trolling, were frequent or heavy users of internet. So basically
Okay.
people who used it more than once a
Ah.
day. The people who were lighter ones were basically if they used it, let's say 2 to 3 times a week or
Mm.
less frequently.
Okay.
So I thought, okay, well,
Yeah.
it should clearly be the case that the people who use it more, they're going to have higher scores.
Yeah.
But actually, the results from the tests found that the lighter internet users were likelier to be trolls as well as victims. And I found, okay, well,
Ah.
how could that be? How is that possible? So
Interesting.
yeah, what I thought
Yeah.
was, okay, for victimization, this
Yeah.
might be due to the fact that, okay, they're less experienced, they're less kind of
Yeah.
knowledgeable, let's say, about the
Yeah.
nuances of online
Yeah.
culture and maybe how to conduct yourself, how to talk around.
Yeah.
And usually that becomes pretty clear. Like you see someone who doesn't necessarily know how to talk online, maybe they write really long paragraphs, or
Mm.
I don't know, don't necessarily know how to convey their tone very well.
Mm.
Uh, and at that point, people can pretty easily identify them. So for trolls, that kind of means that, okay, that's a pretty easy target then, because, it's
Mm.
going to be a lot harder for them to determine, if I'm kind of messing around with them, it's a lot
Mm-hmm.
probably harder for them to, see whether or not I'm deceiving them. So it's pretty easy for them to, see that, okay, that's a clear target that I can kind of mess around with.
Yeah.
Whereas for trolling, I thought, Okay, it might be due to the fact that people who are, people who use the internet quite often, maybe they have the potential to kind of lose their status and reputation in,
Hmm.
communities and groups that they're a part of, because if they're caught trolling, at that point, they would be losing out. So they have something to lose. Whereas,
Yeah.
people who don't really, go on the internet too often, they don't
Hmm.
really have too much to lose, in that situation. So
Right.
that's kind of what I was like thinking, okay, that might
Yeah.
be explaining,
Yeah.
why that is.
Yeah. Well, very interesting results you got there. So, what are the implications of your research findings?
Yeah, so for the first essay, so the more kind of conceptual one,
Mm,
I saw that kind of establishing the brand trolling construct and kind of having a more comprehensive understanding of the construct. And again, the fact that it's just
yeah.
simply kind of out there and where there's going to be start to be a lot more kind of research on it. Maybe it's something that people kind of become a little bit more familiar with. That should kind of, again, not necessarily like right now, but with time, it should make community employees and managers kind of,
Yeah.
it should make them a little bit more aware of the behavior, and hopefully they can kind of better identify and manage the behavior in their respective communities, especially when there is a scale as well out there, like
Hmm.
that does kind of have these objective measures in place,
Yeah.
which again means that maybe if you aren't too familiar with it, you can at least kind of refer to that and at
Yeah.
least have some semblance of an idea. Because again, like
Mm,
I was kind of explaining, a lot of times when people do witness it or are targeted by it or do see it,
yeah.
again, they're always going like, well, is it like, okay, and what exactly does it entail? I'm not quite sure. It's again, it's very much this kind of almost like tacit knowledge where again,
Yeah.
like you just have to have a lot of experience with it and eventually you'll kind of know what it is. But at the same time, trying to explain that in an objective kind of form, like writing it down or
Yeah.
presenting it might be a little bit challenging. So
Yeah.
hopefully having something like this in place at least kind of puts people in the right direction. You're not still
Hmm.
necessarily going to identify it every single time,
Hmm.
but hopefully you do at least have something that you can refer to, which you didn't necessarily have before.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I also think that introducing this should hopefully lead to kind of managers developing some management strategies to hopefully deal with the behavior.
Yeah.
But like I was kind of mentioning as well, like it is important to set the correct expectations about community conduct and behavior,
Yeah.
so that the companies can, or sorry, so that the communities can kind of continue to serve their original purpose.
Yeah.
So again, like you don't necessarily want to have a zero tolerance approach
Yeah.
as well, because sometimes people might kind of
Yeah.
feel like you're being like a little bit too strict. Like sometimes again, like a lighthearted joke, someone might say like, well, that's trolling. So then at that point you get banned. And it's like, well, I didn't necessarily do that. So sometimes might necessarily go a little too much on that direction,
Yeah.
but you don't want it to be completely lax as well, because then at that point you're kind of moving away from your purpose, and instead of like having trying to create relevant content and discussion and
Yeah.
maybe want your questions to be answered, a
Yeah.
lot of times people are just going to be like kind of joking and messing around. You go like, okay, well, what's the point of this community if I'm not able to
Hmm.
do what it's kind of set out to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good.
And another point is probably like the amplified role of bystanders and
Mm,
other community members is really
mm,
important, because again, they with this kind of power that they have, they're at least not necessarily fully responsible, but partially responsible for kind of ensuring that the conduct in the community is appropriate, because again, they do have the ability to report that behavior that kind of goes against guidelines. Because
yeah.
what sets kind of, I'd say, brand communities apart from let's say general interest communities that are just kind of created by any kind of like, let's say, user,
Hmm.
is that they sometimes, it is like the case that sometimes they do have very good codes of conduct in place.
Hmm.
But the reality is, like when I just kind of looked at the few that I'm a part of, was like either they didn't exist at all, were
Hmm.
very very difficult to find,
Yeah.
or then they oftentimes had very vague terms. So they just say something like don't be mean or something. I went like,
Yeah.
okay, well, that's a
Yeah.
good start, I guess, but it's not necessarily specific either. Whereas
Ah.
like every brand community that I kind of looked at, like the few that I was a part of, like
Yeah.
everything, all of them had very kind of specific kinds of
Yeah.
codes and rules and
Yeah.
guidelines in place, and they even had some
Yeah.
sometimes examples of like, okay, this is
Yeah.
what you can do, this is what you can't
Yeah.
do, and try to make it
Yeah.
as black and white as possible. Again, that's not
Yeah.
necessarily like perfect, but at least it
Yeah.
kind of was going in the right direction.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so yeah, I think for the scales, like the fact that they can kind of be
Yeah.
adapted and utilized, because I tried to make it almost kind of general purpose, almost like a blank canvas. So
Yeah.
again, it can be applied into brand communities if you want,
Yeah.
but you can also kind of adapt it into other online areas. So things like social media platforms,
Hmm.
forums, online gaming, comment sections of websites, anything like that. So
Yeah.
kind of think that the adaptability of the scales can kind of be used to assess the impact of trolling and help kind of managers deal with the behaviors in different kinds of online context. So it's not just specifically for brand communities. Obviously, like that's what I would be using for myself. But if you want to use
Yeah.
it for any other kinds of context, I wanted to kind of make it as easy as possible where you can, sort of
Yeah.
adapt it yourself. Because that is something that I notice that people do very often with uh, scales that they do use. They'll adapt it sometimes for their specific purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Kai, what is your advice to those who want to continue this research?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, uh, for the scales themselves, I think there's still a lot more work to be done. Like I kind of
Okay.
wanted to create again, again, a little bit of a foundation. I didn't necessarily want to go over everything because at that point, I think I wouldn't have been able to complete my PhD, or I could have, but it would have taken a lot more time. And it already took enough time, I would say. So I kind of just wanted to create again like a little bit of like a some groundwork, but
Yeah.
there still clearly is like I'd say a lot more room for expansion. So again,
Yeah.
when I was going over the huge amount of trolling papers,
Yeah.
again they mentioned quite often, maybe not as often as the ones that I kind of decided to choose, but they
Yeah.
mentioned things like maliciousness and
Mm-hmm.
aggression, antagonism,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. They
Mm-hmm.
was mentioned pretty often.
Mm.
I've also noticed that they often have mentioned kind of the humorous nature of trolling as
Yeah.
well. So that's
Yeah.
usually a lot more like between friends or people that you at least have some kind of a history with. And I also kind of noticed that sometimes it also has the potential to be positive. Again, usually if it's like I'd say lighthearted in nature, that is possible as well. So
Yeah.
it kind of shows that just how there's a lot more to discover when it comes to measuring
Yeah.
these constructs. And for the first essay,
Yeah.
so my recommendation would be to, well, their propositions and questions. So I'd say, begin to answer them. And hopefully, again, I tried to kind of encourage this because of the scales that I kind of created,
Yeah.
for trolling as well as the victimization.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of wanted to create a little bit of almost like a blueprints for scholars that they can kind of, then adapt to the purposes and goals of their research. And,
Yeah.
if they want to add something to it even further, like I kind of mentioned with the scales, then, be my guest.
Yeah.
And but I'm actually working on some research myself again, where I'm kind of trying to specifically look at some of the potential outcomes
Mm.
of victimization. So I
Mm.
want to see how victimization can kind of impact different types of value. So maybe oftentimes there's a lot of hedonic value or in
Mm.
entertainment, social.
Mm.
A lot of times it could be trying to get
Mm.
information out.
Yeah.
And I also want to see how it could maybe impact some more, I guess, established kind of marketing constructs. So, again,
Yeah.
like ones that we kind of talk about almost ad nauseum in marketing literature is things like, satisfaction, loyalty,
Yeah.
engagement, that kind of stuff. So I'd want to see how that would potentially impact
Yeah.
that as well. So
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, I think that there's like a lot of potential different kinds of directions that you could go into. And then
Yeah.
kind of once that again like kind of foundation has been kind of set, then I can kind of move on to the more involved types of research that exist. Because
Yeah.
I think that's something that I've like kind of noticed as
Yeah.
a well, now being in academia, a lot of times, like I'd
Mm.
rather not get a little bit too ahead of myself, where I
Yeah.
start researching very highly specific kind of situations with
Yeah.
somewhat how would I put it? Like narrower implications. Again, there's
Yeah.
nothing like wrong with that kind of research. Like sometimes those can be amazing, research with a lot of like interesting implications, and
Yeah.
you can learn a lot from them, especially with the methodologies. But I think it's important to, kind of like, don't get too ahead of yourself, kind of try to develop that foundation first and
Yeah.
then proceed on to the more specific and involved types of research that has, a lot of
Yeah.
things like experimentation and interdisciplinary research with different types of context. I think like it's important to, again, kind of start on, the groundwork and then kind of go more into those more specific types of research
Mm.
contexts.
Mm. Nice. So, Kai, you successfully defended your PhD recently. Now that you are on the other side of your PhD, how does it feel to graduate? And what is your advice to students who are interested in pursuing a PhD in marketing?
Well, yeah, Concordia's graduation hasn't happened yet. That's in June, but
Okay.
yeah, it's very, very close, and yeah, feels like a just a load off your back, really. I
Yeah.
remember like my parents were there actually, witnessing my thesis defense, and I remember like
Yeah.
throughout the rest of the day, my mom kept on asking, "How do you feel? How do you feel?" And I just go like, I
Yeah.
don't I don't know. I don't know. I
Yeah.
just it's over. That's
Yeah.
all I can say. Um, but for advice, yeah, there's a few things. I would say like the first thing is choose a good supervisor.
Mm,
Like one who you not even like necessarily like let's say it doesn't have to be that you have the exact same research interests or anything like that, or even like methodologies. I would
yeah.
say like maybe one that you kind of let's say like click with maybe on a
Yeah.
philosophical level, or just generally kind of how you approach like I'll just work in general. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be like too specific. Like again, like and yeah, I'd say also try and choose one fairly early if possible. So,
Mm,
like my supervisor, Dr. Michelle Paulin, like she was fantastic. She was
mm-hmm,
like she's someone like who like just always has your back, like always
mm,
always believed in me and was always kind of
mm,
willing to fight for me, kind of so to speak, whenever there were
yeah.
some sort of speed bumps along the way. Like I remember like there was some time when they said like someone said like, oh, you haven't progressed as quickly and you have to really shape up. And I remember she immediately just like sent me an email saying like, don't worry about that at all. Like it's like they don't necessarily know like all the stuff that you've had to kind of go through and had some like
Yeah.
things that just did slow down. Like sometimes like
Yeah.
uh sometimes you don't necessarily work as best as you can, but then sometimes like I'll be sending something out and like, oh, I have to do a small change and I have to go to the research ethics committee. And then
Yeah.
like one time like they responded within the same day, the other time it
Oh.
was 6 weeks.
Mm,
So it's like at that point, like, what can I did do some work on the side, but eventually it's like, you're just kind of waiting on them. And then there's sometimes, small things go wrong in your sample or something, or, they
mm,
realize like, oh no, I, did something wrong. So, there's a lot of stuff that was going on. She was obviously aware of that, but, maybe the other people who I submitted my work to, like the ones who don't necessarily know too much about that, didn't have all that context in place. So I
mm,
remember she immediately said like, hey, like this is like, don't have to worry about this at all. So I'd say like it's it's very motivating when there's like someone on your
yeah.
side, who always
Yeah.
kind of, has your back and supports you. And whenever I did get messages and interactions, with her, it was always something that kind of motivated me. I always kind of like, okay, yeah, no, I can do this. It was always like something where it's like they always just knew the right thing to say.
Yeah.
Again, like and another really important one that I was very lucky with this, but I've heard some other people who've not been so lucky. But she was always very prompt with feedback and communication.
Mm,
So like whenever I sent something forward,
mm.
basically within like usually 2 hours, she'd be like, okay, yeah,
Wow.
that's great. Or like, hey, you have to change something up. Or at worst, it was like within like one day,
Okay.
basically.
That's impressive.
So yeah, she took like a very humanistic and kind of encouraging approach with me. And I
Yeah.
think that like made a very big difference.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then one other thing was that what I'd probably say is maybe don't try to do everything all at once, especially in the
Yeah.
first year of your PhD, because it's kind of going to be sometimes, a little bit overwhelming. They're going to tell you, hey, you have to start working on this right away. You have to choose a supervisor. You have to
Yeah.
start thinking about your proposal almost immediately. And oh, you're going
Yeah.
to have to do some research assistant work, maybe like, and depending on things, and you're going to have to maybe start teaching and,
Yeah.
oh, try and do like a lot of like courses all at once. Like I
Yeah.
remember and I tried to like juggle maybe a few too many things at once, and it was a
Mm,
little bit overwhelming. Especially like again,
mm,
like not only that, but then it's like a new city that you're in. You don't know too many people, and like that's also a thing. There's a lot of
yeah.
change going on, so it's almost that thing of like sometimes take a step back. Try to
Yeah.
maybe ease your way into things like a little bit.
Yeah.
Don't try to necessarily again like juggle everything all at once
Yeah.
because it's going to be probably a little bit overwhelming for most people.
Yeah.
Or the thing is, like, maybe you can do it, but usually it's a temporary thing. You can do it maybe for one semester, but eventually, you kind of
Yeah.
you reach your limit. So
Yeah.
I'd say, trying to keep a healthy work-life balance. It's not only a
Mm,
PhD thing. That's like, just like a life thing in
mm,
general. But that is something that I'd say like is very, very important. Like sometimes, you do have to keep it things a little bit separate. Like I remember I had a few friends where they said like I think they were planning on it. I'm pretty sure they didn't follow through on it. They said like, oh yeah, I'm gonna even like work during the weekends and stuff. Like I'm just not gonna have like any free time. I went like, maybe you can do that, but I would recommend like probably not. You do have
yeah.
to sometimes keep things a little bit separate. Like again, work is very
Yeah.
important, and but you sometimes have to have some time for yourself and for your
Yeah.
everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, Kai, and all the best.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, again, like I really appreciate this opportunity. It feels nice to kind of put this out there that it's not only just like my supervisors and the few people in my committee who know about it. It's hopefully a few other people might see this and maybe that'll encourage them to research this. You never know.